My name is Gloria Sandoval. I'm the Deputy Director of Public Affairs, and it's my honor to be here today and with these amazing panelists that are going to share with us why it's important for all of us, including Latinos, to take care of our natural and cultural resources. For those joining us online, we welcome any questions that you may have. Please submit them in the chat room. And we will also be taking questions here in the Q&A part of this presentation. So without further ado, Secretary Crowfoot, welcome.
Well, thank you so much. Very exciting to be here, and I'd invite our panelists up to the stage as we begin our conversation today. Yeah. Well, each year between September 15th and October 15th, we celebrate Latino Heritage Month across our state and across our country. And it's an opportunity to lift up our Latino culture, our Latino heritage in California, and Latino leaders that are making a difference across our state. And I am really excited to be here with you all today to celebrate this month, to commemorate this month by really understanding how Latino leaders are leading across California on our most pressing and important priorities in this natural resources agency. As you all know, our challenges are so great with the work that we do, but the opportunities are exciting. So today we're going to be able to break down, what are each of you doing in your roles in the conservation movement. I want to learn a little bit more about what brought you here. How did you become a leader in conservation? And really want to talk about how we can work together and across the state to build more opportunities for Latino leaders to lead in the conservation movement, recognizing just how important it is. So as I said, today we have 4 panelists, 3 who are colleagues and 4 who are friends. From immediately to my left is, of course, Armando Quintero. Armando has been a friend and a colleague and now the leader of our state parks department. We have Esther Tracy, who is our senior environmental scientist at the Department of Water Resources, who I last saw via Zoom when she was actually out on a boat on the McCloud River doing her work. And then we have Emily Lopez, who works for our state's Coastal Conservancy as a South Coast Tribal Liaison, who's joining us from where she's based in Southern California. And then, of course, Jose Gonzalez, who is a founder and emeritus director at Latino Outdoors and is a leader and a friend to many of us. So welcome, everyone.
Thank you. Good morning.
Very excited for you all to be here today. And I'm excited to talk to each of you about both what you do and how you got here, but then the importance of the work that we're doing together and the importance of Latino leadership in the work that we're doing. So I'll just start off to my left. And if you could, Armando, tell us a little bit about your trajectory. We know you as the state parks director, but how did you come to this career? And if you would, what are some of your high-level thoughts as we celebrate Latino Heritage Month today?
Thank you very much, Wade. Is that working? No, it's okay. Thank you very much, Wade. As a child, we didn't go to parks. We went to local parks, community parks, and things like that. But for me, my imagination was absolutely
right here.
No, my imagination was completely lit by wildlife, and my first interest was birds, and then watching television. Flipper inspired me to be a scuba diver someday, and all of those things ended up leading to a whole thread of interests that really connected me with the world. I became sort of infatuated with Mayan cultures. I wanted to travel to Central America. There were all these things that I imagined I would do. And I think just my personal interests continued to allow me to pursue these different threads as I was going to school. And then I started to travel right after high school, and I didn't know what I wanted to do. I thought about being a biologist or an artist, but I found myself dreaming of being a ranger of some sort. I went to national parks, and that ended up becoming a place where I could exercise all these interests: art, diving, natural history, storytelling. And I continued that thread with national parks for 22 years, doing a variety of positions. And then I became a home dad with 2 young daughters, raising them. I ended up connecting to the world through their eyes, which was a whole new perspective. And so the way that I ended up in this role is one of just pursuing my dreams, pursuing my interests, really falling in love with the natural world and natural systems, thinking about rivers and mountains and oceans and wanting to see how all of it worked. And my interests ended up fueling the connections to ended up working with nonprofits in parks. I worked for a university for a dozen years. And then, as you know, I was on the Water Commission for several years. And all of that combined, without my planning it, put me in a position to be considered to be state parks director. So this was a real surprise, honestly. And not sure if you want me to talk about this, but my first day on the job was really a day of absolute focus. I was with Wade and Governor Newsom at Big Basin State Park. There were 17 state parks on fire. We were at the height of COVID. The public was going stir crazy. Parks were absolutely the essential landscapes that people were seeking. And we're looking at climate change and all of these things. And there we were in the middle of it, in sort of the poster child of the world that we're facing. And so I found myself beginning my first day on the job thinking about, how do we deal with this? And one of the things that there were several things that came to mind, and one of them is, we need the best wisdom in the world. We need to reach across cultures, because all of us have a history of land stewardship, no matter what culture you're from. And we need all of it today, because the world is a collection of all kinds of landscapes and ecosystems. And California's diversity is so representative of so many of those places that I think that we have a critical role as leaders in this state in connecting with all cultures as we address the problems and the opportunities of public lands.
Well, we're going to use one mic so we don't have that feedback. Thank you, Armando. More to come. Esther, tell us a little bit about what it means to be a senior environmental scientist at DWR, and then we're really excited about your own professional development, what brought you here to this point.
Perfect, thank you. So I was very fortunate where I grew up in Latin America. I grew up near a research station in Costa Rica, where I grew up around scientists who fostered my curiosity and never stopped telling me why, because I had that question a lot. So I was able to really explore from different aspects and learn from all sorts of different researchers. But then we moved, my dad's a hydrologist. So we worked in contracts every 2 to 3 years. We would move and explore a new country. And so I grew up that way. And then the next place we visited, I was able to learn from some of the indigenous cultures where they really rely on the land. They are stewards of the land for sustenance. So it's very important for them to protect the land because that's what they rely on. And then as I progressed in life and we moved to a different place, I learned how people quickly became disconnected from it. It used to be such a large part of their life, but we've gotten so disconnected from it. But we still practice different sustainability actions without realizing it. You know, there's the joke of, especially in Latino cultures, you have the Tupperware container that used to be a butter container, and it was always filled with frijoles, you know, and beans and leftovers. And you had the bag of bags, and always, as soon as you left a room, it was apaga la luz, turn off the light. So different things like that. That's how I grew up. And then we came here, and I knew I wanted to become a marine biologist because while we were in Honduras, I saw a lot of the people that were struggling to survive, they would use methods of fishing that were not the most sustainable for the planet, but they don't have the education and the understanding of what they're doing. To them, it's survival. So for me, it became a passion of how do we protect their way of being and how do we educate them so that they can pass that along to their children, because that is what they're all going to rely on. And they have to do extreme types of fishing in order to provide and compete with the larger organizations. So how do we find that happy medium? And that's where I realized that I really liked science communication. So I went to the State Water Board. I was in the Office of Public Participation there for 2-3 years. And I really had that passion of teaching the environment or the public about the rules that we're passing and why certain metrics were being placed and why it's protecting them, and what they can do when they lived in communities that are heavily burdened by pollution. So how do we make that better? Can they help advocate for themselves? And then recently I moved here to the Department of Water Resources. I am the lead for the Urban Streams Restoration Program. We are unique in the sense that we require a community group to be part of one of the applicants. So they really have a voice. How do we amplify their voices when we are restoring these streams so that they can have their amenities and their needs met while we're restoring the planet and trying to help the urban streams become a little bit more green and try to best of our abilities bring it back to what it used to be.
And that is really encouraging. That is really encouraging to understand that the science is being implemented and the program that you lead is being implemented in a way that really recognizes the importance of community voice and lifting up priorities from the community. Can you just talk a little bit more about whether that's part of the, kind of built into the program, or is that something that you and others brought to that?
It's part of the program. So it was implemented 35 years ago, but as I transitioned over, we have been more focused on underserved communities. So just because a bill says you have to help a disadvantaged community, we really take a look to see how will it benefit the community. Just because it's directly adjacent doesn't mean that it's going to benefit the communities. There's a major freeway that's dividing the community from the site that's going to be restored. Are you grantee going to then provide transportation to the community members? How are you going to engage with them? What language are you going to provide and make it accessible? How are you going to advertise the transportation to this park? So things like that, where we're able to really use our scientists and our brains and not just use the amazing tools that we have, but then implement them and just use the tools, but further the mission and really make sure that the communities are the ones that are being positively impacted.
Well, as I said, that's really encouraging. And that reminds me of something happening at state parks, where state parks has a statewide parks program where local communities, those that are what we know as park poor, they don't really have the open space that they need, are invited to actually provide proposals in terms of bringing state funding to those communities. But one important requirement is that proposal has to be built by the community. So that's really exciting. And I'm hoping that these two examples ultimately become the norm in state government. So I'm going to hop by Jose for just a moment and turn to Emily and ask you, Emily, both about your current work and what brought you to it.
So I'm going to start with what brought me to it and then get to my current work, if that works. So I'm a first generation college graduate from UC Santa Cruz. And it was my first time ever visiting Northern California when I went to UC Santa Cruz, because all I ever knew was LA. So when I got there, I was just kind of in awe with this new beautiful environment that I was in. I was just amazed by all the redwoods. And so looking at all the redwoods, I was like, wow, wouldn't it be nice to get paid to work for the trees, right? So that was one source of inspiration. And my second source of inspiration was, and I think other Latinx community members can probably relate to this. To me, it always felt a little bit unfair that I was the first out of my family to go to college, experiencing this brand new, beautiful environment, looking at all the redwoods, the deers, the beautiful slugs, while my friends and family were back at home in this highly urbanized place with little to no trees. And so I just remember thinking, I wish my family was here and my friends were here to experience this beautiful forest with me and experience the nature's wonders. So with that said, like I looked into the environmental studies department at UC Santa Cruz, and I thought it was like a really good department because it did a good way of combining the social sciences and the ecology. And so I felt like I was getting the best of both worlds, where I was learning about the ecology and how nature works, but then also how our social impacts to it. So yeah, I think my inspiration was being filled in that direction, because I couldn't just stick to learning about the science and ecology, because I have deep roots in Boyle Heights and South Central LA. So the environmental injustices and bringing that to ecology was very important to me. And so yeah, that was like my source of inspiration to getting to this field. And now I'm proud to say that I work for the State Coastal Conservancy, and I feel the same way. I think I'm being fulfilled in such a way that I get to work on projects. I'm a project manager with the State Coastal Conservancy, and I get to work on projects that are science-based and social-based. So I get to work with scientists to work so that they can implement living shorelines, making sure that they get state grants so that we get our coast to resiliency for when sea level rises. And additionally, I work on social grant programs like Explore the Coast and Coastal Stories, which we'll get into a little bit later. And that makes me feel fulfilled, like we're working on environmental justice programs where we can get people to the coast and vice versa, nature to people. So yeah, that is a little bit about me, and yeah.
That really, really helpful and inspirational. Can I ask you, how did you find out about the opportunity with the state? How was that connection made?
So for me, I think I was just looking for environmental jobs on Indeed, and I came across the Coastal Conservancy. I applied, I think it was like the 4th state job that I had applied to, and this was when I finally figured out how the state application works. And I'm glad that I figured it out, because I really wanted this job. And I started off as an environmental service intern. And I remember thinking, I was like, when I hit submit, it said I was the 98th person to submit an application. And I was like, wow, yeah, I'm never gonna get a call back. There's so many people who applied to this job. And next thing you know, like 2 to 3 weeks later, I received an email saying that I was going to get an interview, and I was like, yes, I got an interview. And so from there, I started off as an intern and then worked my way into project management. And now I'm wearing 2 hats as a South Coast tribal liaison and a project manager.
Wow, incredible. Get used to wearing 2 hats in state government. But I'll say just thank you. And you're a model for other young people around how to get into state government. And I'll give a plug to our career counseling center here on site at the resource agency headquarters. I think it's the first in the state that actually provides HR professionals to be available for folks who want to come into state service working for the agency, or those that are already here working in one of our many departments that want to try to figure out how to continue to advance their career. Because a lot of folks give up historically when they've been applying to the state, and we're so glad that you didn't. So appreciate it, and I'm excited to talk more in just a little bit. Jose, so part of the reason why we're here lifting up Latino environmental leadership is because of leaders like you that have really raised the importance and the opportunity of doing so. So talk to us about the origin story of Latino Outdoors, which is now a nationally known organization, but at one time, I imagine was the thought or the vision of yourself and others. And talk about sort of what brought you to that and a little bit more about Latino Outdoors. And then if you could, to segue into this discussion, where do you think we are at this state of time into really recognizing the importance of the Latino community in preserving the environment and conserving our natural resources?
Of course, thank you. And you know, what I'm excited about is a couple of things that really weave everything that's been shared now and even in earlier sessions with the students. And to me, that's part of the power, right? That I'm like, the uniqueness is that it's not unique, and yet the uniqueness is that we have what we need. And so with Latino Outdoors, you know, it started with some of those basic questions where, are there others like me? I think so many of us have asked that question in one way or another. Knowing the answer is yes, and which would be like, so cool. So where are you all hanging out, right? Is it the Tuesday meeting at 8 o'clock? Funny thing is that now, thanks to programs at like UC Berkeley, there are now Tuesday meetings at 8 o'clock, right? It's like, oh, that's where we're all hanging out. But back when I started, and I hear kind of the same from former state park employees, people that have been doing this work, they're like, it wasn't that easy to really find others like me that had an interest in outdoors, conservation, environmental related work, and that really wanted to, you know, continue to do this cultural wayfinding. Like, what is my cultural identity? What does that mean? So it doesn't feel that I'm converting into something that takes me farther away from roots that are very important to me. And so for me, it was those questions, along with getting some students, undergraduate students that I used to work with, when they're like, cool, we're excited, you know, who do we reach out to? And I was like, that's a great question. There was no amazing new resources agency building with all the HR support. There were no clubs actually at the universities, at least not that we were aware of. If you wanted to go into other professions like teaching, around healthcare, and like we had networks that I felt like we could plug in, but when it came to like environmental conservation related work, I struggled. And I said, that's a great question. I began to ask that and ask others, and had the inspiration to be able to at least create one starting point, which was the birth of Latino Outdoors. And through that power of community, because we've heard that before, right? It doesn't rely on a single individual. It's really you do it with the team, you do it with the community. And Latino Outdoors to me now exemplifies that what we've noticed is you have amazing individuals like Emily and like others. You have individuals who have been here for some time, like Armando, right? Like, you've been doing this. And to be able to say, in what ways are we visible that we may not have been visible before, but we come with the skills, with the passion, with the leadership, and some of us are fortunate enough to hit that pathway. And I was finding that a lot of others were saying, I tried volunteering, you know, in this space. I tried showing up on a volunteer with this organization, and I didn't fit in. There were just little things that didn't make me feel like it was for me. And so with Latino Outdoors, it was to provide that platform, community, and organization where that could be visible. And we often say you didn't have to feel you had to leave your cultura at the trailhead. All of a sudden, you're going to show up at the hiking spot. And it wasn't like, well, now I got to wear the right thing. Now I got to eat the right thing. Now I got to say the right thing. So what could it look like? And that's the birth of Latino Outdoors, for us to, as a community, try to show what that could look like, what it sounded like, what it felt like. And how that wove into, you know, kind of the second part of the question is, for me, is being able to really acknowledge a couple of things. One, to me, like when we talk about Latinidad, it's beautiful and messy. And then I think, but you know what, so is nature. Nature is beautiful and messy and yet efficient and thriving. It has all these things. So it allows me to think about my identity as an estuary and how it's not a pool. It's got fuzzy boundaries, but it's a zone of abundance with different sources. And it takes work, right? To like keep it healthy. At the same time, we try to think about how can we show up as our cultural selves, knowing that we all have a lot of healing to go through as we reconnect to our indigeneity, to all of our different sources, right, that form our identity. And then we get to decide, what have we inherited that no longer serves us, as well as what does it mean to be a future ancestor. So, Latino Heritage Month, 10 years from now here, that will be familiar and yet very different, right? Because of who the community is invested. And then lastly, for me, it's been exciting because I think about, how can I be who I needed 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, when I was basically looking at, like, where's Armando? And Armando didn't know I was here. But I know he was also kind of looking, so where is everybody, did I miss the Tuesday o'clock meeting? But knowing to be able to say that, and Armando stressed this before, a career path in this, me ending up in this stage with you, with all of you at this moment, wasn't this linear path. And so we talk about, career pathways as braided rivers. It has all these sources and it's kind of sinuous all over. And yet, as long as you're supporting a sense of direction and some nurturing along that, it has that direction and flow. And also we know that if you try to challenge the river, it's no longer a river. You kind of kill the, the life of it. And so I could not have known that I'd be here. And so I started in public service and education, took the nonprofit route, and I've been trying to create these little zones of abundance so that as I continue, there will be so many others behind me. And so I'll close by saying it's part of why I'm also grateful that I serve as a board member for Parks California, which is the statutory partner to the California State Park System, and then as a new commissioner for boating and waterways. So one of the many ways that I try to kind of like be a part of and support to nurture this network of community.
That's incredible. And this whole notion of institutionalizing this through all the different hats you're wearing is really, really impressive. Esther, I'm interested in your perspective as a scientist, in terms of understanding we have a lot of scientists across state government and across our agency. And Jose was talking about being able to show up in, environmental community as one's authentic self, and also bringing other aspects, of your heritage. And given it's Latino Heritage Month, how has the journey been for you as a scientist and a Latina scientist in this network of state scientists we find ourselves in?
It has not been without its challenges. So as a fisheries biologist, I am generally the only Latina and the only woman in groups sometimes. It isn't always the most inviting. So I would encourage all of you that are looking to get into it, just be patient, continue working, seek out others that can provide support. We can change it and we will change it. And it is becoming more inclusive, which is lovely. A message to my fellow scientists is continue making the information accessible. And by accessible, I mean, get to know your audience. Try to make it at a 5th grade level, just so that people are able to digest the information. Whenever possible, translate it into other languages. That is one of the things that I have, and look for proper translation services. Google Translate is not the most appropriate. When a plume of water is translated to a feather of water, you're doing a disservice. So just know that there are key terms that need to be translated correctly. Hold on, let me look at my notes. Oh, and also for me, one of the important things is I always believe that one of the important things with science is to share the information. We have so many great scientists and so many different schools and even agencies that are doing great work. If we're not sharing, if we're not collaborating, then we're doing the public a disservice. So just make sure you're finding different ways to connect. If you're able to participate in science fairs, that is a great way to show up and pass on that science, and that encourage those young scientists to continue growing and share your personal stories. Like, why did you get there? Why is your culture important? For me, I always love talking about where I came from and why I'm a scientist. So as soon as they hear, I grew up in Latino America and started doing this, and they're like, oh, that's so cool. You just spark that little bit of joy. So you're able to continue. And then they ask about my culture, and I'm happy to pass that along. But no, definitely, I think the key points for me is just be you, be proud of who you are, be patient, and try to educate in many different aspects.
Well, thank you. Armando, we talk a lot about our diversity as our source of strength in California, but if we're being honest, our institutions aren't as diverse as they need to be. We have 40 million people in California, tremendously talented universe of folks, yet the institutions that you and I represent don't reflect that diversity. I remember in learning about your career, you were tapped by the National Park Service early on to really help them identify how can you bring more folks from different backgrounds into the Park Service as rangers. So reflect a little bit about what you've learned since that time, and frankly, what's the state of our institutions in terms of being a place that's welcoming to Latina scientists or folks that have historically been underrepresented in our institutions?
Thank you for that question. Being my first language was Spanish. And so as I was growing up and going to school and getting in trouble because I was speaking Spanish instead of English and things like that, language became a really important thing early on, and being able to understand people. And one of the things with institutions, federal and other government and state institutions, is there's another language there. And oftentimes it's that language that has to be translated to the public. I mean, you were all talking about applying for jobs, and it's like, really, the words you use matter. And so when I worked for national parks, I left the field as a park ranger, went into personnel, and I got trained in HR. And boy, did the lights go on. I didn't realize, for example, that there were 14 doorways through which one could get career status with the federal government. Nobody had ever told me that. So I put together a simple guide for how to do that and got the word out. And in recruitment, which I did for a few years for national parks, I was actually very direct about what we were looking for. And just recently, I was down at San Onofre meeting with the Brigadier General at that Marine base. And as we went into a meeting room, I saw a sign that the Marines have, and it just said, "We're interested in hiring people like you." And that really is how we need to present ourselves to the world. And what we need to do along with that, which is what you mentioned earlier, we now have a multi-department recruitment team at our recruitment center. And what they do is, in fact, Sochi, who works for state parks in recruitment, workforce planning and recruitment, when I meet people and say, oh, you've got to meet Sochi, and I'll introduce them to her via email. And I just love it when I see her response, which is, let's set up an appointment and send me your resume. And if you don't have a resume, let me help you put one together. And I think in all careers, it's our mentors and it's the networks that really help create the framework on which we can climb, like a playground structure, and that's what we need to develop very intentionally. And we also need to think about our own language too. I mean, I worked for national parks for 22 years, and literally toward the end of it, I honestly was tired of being reminded that I was Mexican. It was like continual, and in different ways. I mean, I know that a lot of us who speak other languages, you'll be talking to somebody, they'll say, wow, you're really articulate, which is, it's intended as a compliment, but it's like, oh, really? And oftentimes when that's happened with me, I've learned to respond, oh, so are you. Where did you go to school? But also I think for us, and I mean the big us, the royal us, it's important to be vulnerable and think about your own experience with the world, because, I know that I've made huge cultural faux pas in talking with folks of other cultures. So I don't claim to have any, any hold on it. So anyway, I think behaving as a department where we are being very clear in our language, very clear about the mechanisms by which people can get positions with us. And that is what we're doing with our recruitment teams now. And I'm also particularly thrilled about the very same recruitment support services being made available to career employees, because that's something that is really lacking. In most organizations, usually you have to wait for someone to mentor you and pick you out of a crowd, and everyone else, it's like, how did that happen? Well, we can do it formally, and I think create a much more equitable landscape in which we can recruit, hire, and learn.
Well, let me turn to Emily. You know, you're a young leader that we want to recruit many more of. And from our perspective, as I've learned about what you've been doing at the Coastal Conservancy, the perspective that you bring is strengthening the work that it's doing. So if you would, tell us the story about really sharing your perspective on what the stories that need to be told as it relates to coastal access, et cetera. Because as I understand it, you and some others brought forward an idea rather courageously to your leadership that ultimately turned into something quite impressive.
Yes. So this program, the Coastal Stories program that we brought to upper management would happen after the COVID-19 outbreak and the death of George Floyd, which propelled the Black Lives Matter movement. And there was so many social injustices brought to the forefront, and in the environmental field, all the environmental disparities that Black, Indigenous, and people of color face were brought forth too. And so a team, 3 colleagues and myself, thought we're in our Justice, Equity, and Diversity and Inclusion Committee. We were having a meeting and we were like, okay, so there's a social call to action in the world right now. What can we do within our agency to respond to the call to action? And so we thought about how on the coast there is so many signages and monuments that are from white European settler perspectives. And so we saw a need or a space where we can broaden those stories from other cultural perspectives, especially Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And so after that, we brought that idea to management, and they said, okay, well, we have $1 million for you guys to try this grant program out. And so we started developing the program, and in October, we released the pre-proposal applications and received a total of 80 applications that amounted to a total of $13 million in requests, which was astonishing because I think it goes to show how there's so many stories out there that could be told. And we were only able to select $1 million, which was 6 stories. And so we do have another grant round next year, but we don't have continuous funding set out. But next year we will go again for another grant round. And then after that, our team is trying to figure out how we can set up a platform or a strategy where we can host all of these stories and still make them accessible to the public. Because again, there is, even out of those 6 applicants that we got to choose, there's still so many things to consider in terms of how did there were great stories, by the way, but there's other community-based organizations that don't have the time or resources that could have made it to the top applicants. So we're trying to consider all the different varieties that get folks to receive a grant. And so hopefully we can work.
And Emily, who do you want to learn about these stories, these 6 stories? Well, who's the target audience? What does success look like?
So the target audience is all of Californians, and because it's Latinx Heritage Month, the Latinx community, I hope that the Latinx culture feels more welcome and has a sense of belonging in our outdoor spaces. Because a lot of the times we don't see ourselves in these spaces. And so hopefully once we see signages or people who are working in the outdoor field, that once you see yourself in, you feel a sense of belonging. Also with that, I think I hope that we can work as Californians to realize that we're all traditional users of outdoor spaces in our own ways, because nature is for everyone. And there's a Spanish saying that says, el sol sale para todos, which it translates to the sun comes out for everyone, because nature does not discriminate.
That's a great segue to a question I have for Jose. This connection between the discussions around inclusion and public policy. So as I understand it, Latino Outdoors, and you've been a leader, really both advancing environmental policy, conservation policy, and also ensuring that it actually is helpful for everybody. Can you talk about that and how that's manifesting in efforts and at the state level?
Yeah, and I think early on, with Latino Outdoors, we had that question. So what makes it a Latino Outdoors hike, right? How's that going to be different than another outdoor hike put on by another community group? It's like, that's a great question, because there wasn't going to be a prescription, right? There's no Latino card you have to show up. It's like, well, okay, what term do you use? And then we'll figure out whether, we agree or not. I'm like, that's not the approach to really think about, to Armando's point, what language are we using? So we wanted to talk about that. What language are we using that speaks comfort and familiarity in terms of what food is invited? Not what we're saying to bring, but rather what we are inviting you to bring. So you are showing up to provide that, to the humor, right? To how we're welcoming people. One of the first hikes that I did in Central Valley in Modesto was we invited the families to come out for a Sunday hike. They read Sunday, family, and then park. So they showed up dressed as you would for a city park. But this was a protected riparian ecosystem. This is, I just blanked out on the park name, so now I feel guilty. It's like the only protected riparian ecosystem right there on the San Jose Rivers as a state park. And then I was the only one dressed in hiking pants. You had a dad showing up with his botas, right? Sunday best tejana. And the question there was, is he still dressed to be safe and comfortable on this hike? And the answer is yes. So we weren't going to be like, oh, you're not dressed the part. So I put that because then we really were thinking, how are we approaching how we want to do this work? And we have these 4 Ps: people, place, process, and policy. As a way to recognize that we want to support a holistic approach, but Latino Outdoors wasn't founded as an advocacy organization in that traditional sense. We weren't created to particularly just drive policy, while also acknowledging that that comes as an ask for when you go out there and you're visible when you do the work. So people in place was, how do we create opportunities so that people continue to be in community? Place, they're very connected to the places where we are. Is it a state park? Is it a national park? Is it a coastal national monument? We want people to understand that, as well as the history of people, as well as the biodiversity of it. Process is, how do you do this safely and comfortable? Because there are times when you might need a technical piece of gear, and other times no. It's understanding how you can make those decisions. So if you want to visit a particular brand store, go for it and feel welcome there. Now, the policy, we scaled it up, kind of think of it in 2 ways. One is policy, we say, these are people decisions. How this state park exists right now is because of people decisions. Decided what lines on the map were there and what gets to be protected in particular ways and what doesn't. We're doing this right now in California with all of the amazing biodiversity, 30 by 30, you name it, right? They're people decisions. And this is going to show up in the maps of the future, just as we've inherited maps of the past. And we're going to change some of those. We're going to tweak some of those. They're going to look different. And then the other one is recognizing so that if people decisions can be something as like, go tell your vecino or vecina, your neighbor, hey, did you know that there's a new state park opening up here, like in our area? I didn't even know that this was a thing. Show up to your local city council, be able to say, how come we're not funding enough? At the state level, we want to recognize 3 things. One is the strength of community. You have organizations like Azul, right, and other colegas that are very driven in being able to make this work. You also have colegas within quote unquote mainstream conservation organizations that are also doing their part within that. And then be able to work with elected officials, because that's also who you need to be able to be on board and be like, yeah, how come we're not funding it in this way and whatnot. work with the agencies and administration to be able to say, yeah, that should align as a priority. So all of these things to come together when we can get things like the Outdoor Equity Grants Program through state parks. It's another component of public funding that is necessary because private funding, as we know, will help. And yet public funding is an incredible investment and powerful level that really gets to shape a little bit what these structures look like. How we're we always say, how are we prioritizing, how we're designing the maps? And it's not the only thing, as Armando, does a great job of saying, people may not be familiar that we're talking millions and even billions of dollars of public investment in park access and park equity. The Outdoor Equity Grants Program is one aspect of that, to be able to say, let's be intentional and focus, and how are some ways of connecting maybe haven't been funded before. Like programming can be hard to fund, right? So we're thinking, what can support programming compared to the actual physical infrastructure of park? And so all of this is what we're having conversations with communities, because they'll show up and say, how come the bathrooms aren't fixed? Or I see a new trail, but I'm not gonna go out there because I don't know what to do, or if I show up, I'm afraid I'm gonna get in trouble with the ranger, right? And it's all these little conversations that, to me, groups like Latino Outdoors and other affinity groups are helping to weave that, so that we meet the intention of why we want to allocate this funding, down to the reality of that community engagement, which is necessary to kind of have a feedback loop into this policy. And I'll close by kind of saying what excites me is I'm reminded of the reality of historical harm, like redlining maps, right? When we say those weren't individual choices, those weren't individuals saying, I want to choose to live here or not there. There's structural pieces to that. And if we don't change those, then we inherit those maps and they show up in different ways, including park access. What I'm excited about is through policy as one mechanism, we get to shape what those maps look like. So 50 years from now, we can say these maps look different because of these policy decisions, these community decisions, these programming decisions, these relational decisions that we've decided to undertake now.
Yeah, so true. And what you say about these are people decisions. I mean, everything that led us to this, whether it's a lack of diversity among our employees or a park system that benefits some more than others, these were decisions that were made in the past. And if we're going to actually make changes, they're decisions that essentially we need to change right now and in the future. And I'm so appreciative of your leadership. Esther, not only are you showing up in the scientific community as a leader, as a Latina scientist, but you're also leading a program that's really ensuring that communities are designing the solutions. Armando, you're bringing major, cultural change to an incredible institution, which is our state park system. And then, of course, Emily, you're bringing a perspective that, frankly, our entities that were focused on coastal conservation in the past didn't have. So I'm really lucky to share the stage with you. I think we planned for the discussion to turn the tables on me, I think, a little bit with Jose. You were going to ask me a question, ensuring some accountability on the leader of the conversation here.
I'm happy to start it off and, of course, invite others into that. I think one of the questions we had is, of course, also hearing from you the value, right, of partnership in this way that goes from even having an event like this. We often said that the recognition, in that sense, it's important. Just a few years ago, we had, from as far as we can tell, because California is always great in leads, right? As far as we can tell, the first legislative resolution recognizing the value of the Latina community in conservation. We tried to look for it. No other state had done it. And yet that had power. All the way to actually structural opportunities and partnerships, right, with organizations like Latino Outdoors, but a host of other organizations doing this work. So the question is that, can you tell us more about how you see the value and what inspires you and excites you about this value of partnership in this work?
Absolutely. I mean, I think our future is bright in California, in state government and this agency, but it's bright because of who we are as Californians. And as I've said, what's remarkable about California is we are thriving across every conceivable difference. And one of which is our race and ethnicity and our national origin. And as I've said, we inherited these institutions that are remarkably weak in the sense that they are homogenous and they don't actually bring and recruit and retain the tremendous diversity of people that we have across California. And it's not only, based on, in terms of race and ethnic diversity, but it's also about geographical diversity. Folks with formal educations, non-formal educations, those with Western science backgrounds, indigenous backgrounds. The list goes on and on. So one thing I'm really excited about is lifting up the importance of our Latino heritage across California. I mean, Latinos comprise over 40% of California. And so much of what makes this state great is our Latino heritage. But institutions and state government haven't lifted up the value of that heritage in the past to our own detriment. And so from our perspective, what I'm trying to do as a leader is really voice the value of our diversity, and in this case of celebrating Latino Heritage Month, because we are stronger. The more conservation leaders we have who are Latino, Latina, Latinx, who are of all backgrounds, we are stronger when we empower the Latino community to really lead on conservation. Something I don't think we've mentioned is if you look at public opinion polling across California, two of the groups, actually three of the groups, if you break it out by race and ethnicity, that are strongest in terms of supporting environmental conservation are the Latino community, the Pacific and Asian Islander community, and the African American community. Yet we haven't lifted up that leadership. So to me, it's a tremendous opportunity. And I think we have to walk the walk, which is conversations like this, but then we have to, well, I should say we have to talk the talk, and that's what I'm doing. But we have to walk the walk too. So from my perspective, the institution we're going to leave whenever I'm done, hopefully, Armando feels the same, is institutions that are stronger because they are including all community perspectives. They're being built, programs are being built by and for the community. The leadership that we have reflects the diversity of California. And I'm excited. Emily talked about the reckoning that we had in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd. And I'm really glad to say that this is a reckoning that continues, that we're being held accountable for. It was just last month, that the governor instituted or issued an executive order that we have to institutionalize equity action plans across our departments and agencies. And I'm glad to say that within our agency, we're already far down the road on that. But the whole idea is to be very explicit with what you're doing as an organizational leader to really build diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, and then actually be held accountable for making progress. So I think that's what really excites me. It's so rewarding to hear about the leadership and to lift up the leadership and to have this conversation. And I'm equally energized by actually driving the institutional change that we need. Success for me in 10, 20 years, looks like we're continuing to celebrate this month, but we're doing so by recognizing more and more leaders doing this work. And really the norm, it becomes the inclusion and the leadership of the Latino community, and frankly, all of the communities. Yeah. Our colleague Moy has a roving mic here, and we're joined by a whole lot of people online as well who may have submitted chat questions in through the question and answer feature on Zoom. So Gloria or Moy, Gloria,
We're both taking this on.
great.
Thank you for sharing your stories. So we have a lot of people online, which we're very happy to hear that. They have a couple of questions. There are many best practices from Latin America, such as Medellin, Colombia, and how to integrate nature and the natural world into our daily lives. Whether through open architecture and green building or incorporating a nature ethos into daily life, how can we borrow and build on this in California and bring to individual lives on a daily basis? And this question is open to anyone.
Happy to quickly start on that and then turn it over because that question speaks to me. So I'm an immigrant from Mexico, came to the US right age of 9, had one of my awakenings at a California State Park, Calaveras Big Tree, saw sequoias for the first time, and I was like, what? And I carried a lot from my upbringing in a relatively small rural town that I didn't know what it was yet because I was just growing up. And it was only until I came to the US that I noticed some contrast and be like, okay, we've had reusable bags. There's the abuelita bag, right? Yes, to the butter container having frijoles and all. Like, so we've had conservation practices. And two things that I would offer to that would be, one of the ways that I'm continuing to push myself is really think about the logic that I use about the relationship to each other and to the land. And what I mean by that is, one example I like to use is when we use the expression, your team is functioning like a well-oiled machine. You hear that, it's like, yeah, we're being efficient. It's intended to, speaking to language, it's intended to encourage, as a compliment, encourage you. And I said, what if I came to you and said, like, your team is functioning like a well-nurtured meadow? Then what changes, right? Because especially here, none of us are going to go to meadow and be like, do better, meadow, right? Like, you're not meadowing enough. We understand it has its own thrivability and efficiency, but this can now ask us to think about, what are we valuing in terms of outputs, relationship, leadership, and so forth. And then the last one, the other one would be on these daily practices related to that, is be able to say, as I move through the day, I may not keep track of all the research about how nature is good to me, right? I may not be aware of all the policy briefings. There's so much I don't know. And yet, if I could move through the day and ask myself some basic questions to say, how much in nature have I been today? And in fact, I have an expression for myself: be in nature, as nature, in radical and revolutionary balance. Radical is about roots, and revolutionary is about cycles. So how am I being in those ways?
Well, I would just add a couple things. One is the question was asked about Medellin, and it's important to recognize there is a lot of environmental innovation coming out of Colombia, but also Latin America. In California and across the US, we now do these car-free days where folks can run and bike. Well, that was the ciclovia in Bogota that started 35, 40 years ago. That actually closes 100 kilometers of roadway in Bogota to bikes and walking. So let's recognize, one, the importance of looking to Latin America for innovation. And then two, to your point, Jose, we haven't done enough to value nature as a solution to a lot of our challenges, including climate change. We look a lot about technology, electric vehicles and solar panels, all that, all important, but now we're uplifting nature. And to Esther's point, when we're doing science, when we're doing our projects, really listening to community and to ensure that actually, a lot of times the folks that are closest on the ground understand the health of their streams, right? Or in the case of our tribal partnerships, tribal practices that have been engaged for thousands of years. We need to listen more, lift up nature, but then also listen to the folks that are actually right there to understand how we do that.
I'll mention a couple things. One of them is that when Big Basin burned to the ground, literally the oldest state park in California, when we went there on that first day that I started work, we literally talked about the need to reimagine these places and reimagine them in a way that was truly sustainable for centuries into the future, not thinking about what traditions do we bring forward, which may or may not work. And one of the things that comes to mind for me when you mentioned meadows, Jose, is the idea that in science, one of the richest places for diversity and strength is an ecotone, which is where two systems come together. You can think of a tide pool at the surface of the ocean where the shore meets the water and air is hitting that area as well. At the edge of a meadow and a forest, those are ecotones. And I think that that is, to me, a beautiful model of what diversity is actually about. It's about mixing, it's about nutrients, it's about conditions, and all the things that make for a truly healthy system. And one of the things that state parks does do is when we're now doing park planning, there is a tremendous amount of community outreach that goes on in order to get the input of the diversity of communities out there. And I'll finish with this. In my history with national parks and going to national parks throughout the nation, but mostly in the West, it dawned on me one time that parks had this very strange sort of personality about them, which I came to realize was anchored in the decade in which the park was created. in some ways, parks have become a time capsule of the 1920s or the turn of the century. And I think that by re-examining how we're doing things today, it offers us a really powerful reminder of thinking that even as we go forward, we need to continually reimagine these places with new knowledge, with new science, as we make the decisions as a community. And I think when you were talking, Wade, I think that's the sort of tradition we want to pass forward.
Just want to say that we have over 200 people online that are tuning in, and it's really, really exciting. And they're providing us with a wealth of comments and questions. And I want to read some of the two of the comments. It says, it's not a question, but as a fellow Latina in state service and as someone with a science background, it is wonderful to see a panel of successful Latinos in leadership roles, very inspiring. And the other one is, no question here, but just an appreciation to all the panelists. So inspiring to hear you talk about your work in conservation. And earlier today, we had the governor's climate advisor, Lauren Sanchez, talk about her career pathway. And we also had a presentation by Parks recruitment director, Sochi Proc, who's in the back. And we had other recruiters talk about, their career pathways and ways that our agency could bring in folks along to our, to work with us. And then we also heard from the Sacramento State Capital Executive Fellowship Program, and the major message was that you belong, right? That folks belong, and that it doesn't hurt to apply, even if you're questioning it. And that really stemmed from a comment that Sochi, kicked us off in. We're joined in person by UC Berkeley's Latinx and the Environment Initiative, where we also have students from other programs within the Berkeley campus that are here today. And the longing question that came up online is, why does it matter? Why is this important? And how can they at some point be there? And that's a general question for the panel.
So I think Esther maybe mentioned this earlier, that a lot of Latinos already do care for the environment. And in many ways, our cultural practices is aligned with conservation practices. And in 2016, Green Latinos released a survey saying that 77% of Latinos are concerned about climate change, which is great, right? It's great to hear that we're concerned, because we're becoming the largest population in California, and yet we're the most vulnerable to climate disasters. And so I think it's important that we have more Latinx folks coming into this field and creating more representation in different environmental sectors, because we need to figure out how our cultural practices and ideas and relay our community messages back into leadership that will make a difference when we're thinking about climate change and how it works for everyone. Yeah, so please join us.
And I would just add, we need young leaders that are bold and creative. At the end of the day, the people leading government, frankly, look like myself and Armando. We've got a little bit left in our careers, but not a whole lot left. And we need to move quicker than we've ever moved to combat climate change, to protect vulnerable communities, to protect the environment. And it's often, young leaders who are pushing us to go further and faster. So one thing we're really involved in, as Moy mentioned, is really working to try to figure out, how do we recruit the best and brightest, the folks that are sitting in our audience. We want you to be where we are in the matter of a couple of decades. And frankly, we've got a great bench of leaders who will be. But from my perspective, there's nothing more important than you could do than to join public service to actually make a difference. Where you can be a leader that comes with these ideas and changes things that really make a difference. So just thanks for your leadership to the crew from UC Berkeley, what you're doing, and know that, if we're successful, you'll find your way into some level of government, some public service to lead on the issues we're talking about today.
I think for me, why it's important to recruit and have a more diverse group is, so in some of the programs I've worked before, there's a bill that is passed, and it is up to us to then interpret what is meant by it and how we can best apply it to benefit the community. So if we have different minds that are contributing to these ideas and how it's implemented, and we can then pass it on to leadership, we can really create programs that are beneficial to those communities that are most severely being impacted. A lot of the communities that live in highly polluted areas and have the greatest risks and health issues are from people of color, you know, Blacks, Latinos, all of it. And so if we're able to really influence policies and programs that can benefit these communities, we can really start making those changes and try to address and help and alleviate some of those health issues that we're seeing. So for me, that's why it's important to have different visions. We measure an ecosystem, its health by how diverse it is. How many different populations and organisms can it support? It's the same way with some of our programs. How many different people can we really benefit? How diverse can we make this to make it the most efficient and beneficial for all?
So that's a good segue for the following two questions, and it's for Secretary Crowfoot and Director Quintero. For the last 10 to 15 years, departments and resources agency have struggled to recruit, retain, and promote Black, Indigenous, people of color, especially in leadership positions. Do you see opportunities for non-career candidates to fill leadership positions? If yes, how do interested candidates learn more about these positions?
I'll take the first crack at that. So there are different ways to work for government. One is through a system a lot of people have heard of called the civil service. And I think that's what that Emily entered in through. And that is essentially identifying or understanding what positions are available, and then taking an assessment, which sometimes gets called an exam, an assessment that helps understand, you know, where you're at, and then applying through a fairly formulaic position. Most of the leadership jobs, certainly the job that I have and the job that Armando has, come as political appointments. And it's actually the governor and the governor's office that appoint several thousand leaders across state government. And I think the rationale is when the public elects its leader and the governor, for example, then he or she really needs to have their leaders in place to actually promote their agenda to try to get things done. So to the question, a lot of the leadership opportunities are available through that political appointment. And so the way to actually, and I'll mention that Governor Newsom has been committed to ensuring that those political appointments reflect California's diversity. And as we've talked about here today, historically, they have not. Period, full stop. And the governor has challenged us not to improve incrementally in terms of the diversity that's represented, the gender balance that's represented, but his target is really by the end of his time as governor, he wants to see that universe of political appointments reflect the diversity of California, certainly as it relates to race and ethnicity, certainly as it relates to the representation of the Latino, Latina, Latinx community. So we have an appointment secretary in the governor's office, a woman by the name of Catherine Rivera Hernandez. And her team are focused on doing the outreach to help people understand how to actually put themselves in the mix for those political appointments. So I may get in trouble with Catherine and her team, but you can actually find these folks on LinkedIn. And if you want them to present to your communities, or if you're a leader, they're really about getting out there, because that's our benefit. Selfishly, we need a broader talent pool of candidates. And so Catherine and her team are doing a wonderful job of getting out there and presenting on these opportunities. So if there's follow-up, put it in the chat in terms of if there's presentations that participants would like to see in their communities or associations or universities, because those political appointments are a really fast route to decision-making.
I certainly agree with everything that Wade just said, but I also think that at a personal level, any of you can get involved now in positions that'll put you on that trajectory. You can get on a local government body, you can get on a water board, you can get on a city parks commission. And there's a number of those sorts of organizations where you live. I also really recommend getting involved with nonprofits that are really pursuing something that is your passion. Because when you do all of those things, what it really does, it can put you in a decision-making body, and also it puts you in an incredible network of others who are engaged in the very sorts of things that you're interested in. And oftentimes those are connected up through into state leadership positions. So there's other routes that you can take to get that background and experience. And to the question that you just asked, Gloria, if you just look in the last few years at what the CNRA and state parks has been doing with regards to MOUs with tribal groups. I mean, we just, the CNRA and state parks just signed an MOU with the Yurok tribe, which actually gives that tribe access to traditional plant materials across the park. It gives them open access to all of their ceremonial sites. There's now a visitor center in that park that is only staffed by Yurok people telling the stories of the Yurok people. And there are other advantages that not advantages, basically they're rights when you think about it. We are actually actively creating to work with communities to make sure that they are represented in the cultivation, if you will, in the bigger sense, the cultural cultivation and the actual physical community cultivation and protection of these areas. And we also have to work in partnership with the state legislature. And this year they've given state parks, excuse me, funding to work with the California African American Museum in order to illuminate the histories of African Americans throughout state parks across the state. And one of the things that I would encourage any of you, when you go to a park of any sort, take a look at the photographs that they have in their exhibits. And when you look at those photographs, they are a diversity of people, but oftentimes the diversity of those people is not represented in the stories that are told. And so I also think that lastly, what I would say is lift up the people around you. Be a part of the network that raises others into these positions and connections that you have. That's how it will work. And I know that I'm here in great part to the mentorships and colleagues that have guided me. And it wasn't always my supervisors.
Well, we have one last question here in person, and then we'll turn it back to you, Secretary Crowfoot, for a lightning round so that we could end this celebration today.
So, buenas tardes. Muchas gracias. My name is Lupe Gallegos Diaz. I'm one of the co-founders for Latinos in the Environment at UC Berkeley. And actually, it's more of a comment because one, it's very inspirational to see all of you up there as leaders representing our different communities. So first of all, thank you on that. Second, also because you're actually in practice doing the intergenerational knowledge sharing, which sometimes panels don't tend to reflect that. So thank you for that, because I see that up there. And the last one is that you're also representing intersectional identities, which sometimes also I don't see that on panels. And I think that's very important for our young people to really see the diversity even within the Latinas, the diaspora of Latinos, of our knowledge and our wisdom. So I just wanted to thank you for the invitation and for our young people to be here just to listen and to be and bear witness to the actual work that has been done before, that is being done, and what they're going to be doing for the future. So muchas gracias.
Well, huge thanks back to you. And we really see, your students and you as students as the leaders, again, of agencies like the one we now represent. So let us know where we can build stronger connections. Because if success to me is if some of you students are interested in joining the state and decide that you want to pursue that. So help us understand how we can better recruit. And I think Jose wants to say something, and then I'll do a quick lightning round.
I'll close that real quickly with this because you've heard this before, right? Some of us wish there was a you now, and you might be thinking, how do we get to be there? And it's related. So when I was an undergrad student, first of all, to be clear, as an undergrad student, I had no idea what it was gonna go. And then even once I got my graduate degree, then I kind of maybe knew. So just to address that question, if it's like, do I have the right major? Am I making all the right connections? Who should I be bothering on LinkedIn? Yes, to all of it. But when I was an undergraduate student, I was in my local mecha. And there we were so focused on a lot of social justice work. And I had this question, do we get to do anything on our environmental work? And then I was in my environmental advocacy student club. And then I was like, do we get to do any related work with like this other work we're working in Mecha? Because I'm like, they're kind of the same, they overlap. You're doing that now. So just know that, how you are advancing the work by what you're doing. And the other two things are, one, starting this and asking, looking around. And that's why I first ran into Ricardo, who saw me, and then he's like, right here in the front, he's like, uh-oh, two Chicanos, you know what they say, one Chicano, two Chicanos, better careful, because if it's a third one, it's a revolution in the room. And yet here we are, right? Here we are, still a long way to go, but it is how we're connected to our ancestors and the work that they've done, that they started, that they did within state parks, that we're trying to continue to advance in all these other elements. And then the last one for me is this reminder of, we're familiar with the expression si se puede, right? And then I often add, pero hazlo, because this is the one thing that was shared with me that I shared back, which is how would the person you would like to be? So imagine yourself in 5 years, in 10 years, or even just you graduated. Think of that person. What do you want them doing? And now, how would the person you like to be do what you're about to do now? To let you know that through imposter syndrome, to everything that you feel you're not sure if you belong or fit there, you do. And have the future you help you with that.
Those would be incredible last words, but let me just start a quick lightning round, which is in a sentence or two, what do you hope for on the topics we've talked about in the last 10 or in the next 10 or 20 years? Doesn't have to be your grand vision, but at least one thing that you hope for in 10 to 20 years.
One word.
No, 1 or 2 sentences.
I know.
Oh, you're saying.
My one word is vente.
I would say for everybody to feel included and to feel seen and heard and welcome in outdoor spaces.
It's a reminder that regardless of your community, you are now the mainstream.
Yeah, I just hope to see everyone go on hikes more and see more diversity in our national parks, our state parks, and yeah, so I hope that you go on hikes and feel a sense of belonging.
Well, huge thanks to our panelists, which is an incredible panel, inspirational. Let's give them a hand. Big thanks to our colleagues, Moy and Gloria, for organizing and for all who have participated in the room today and online. Thank you once again, and happy Latino Heritage Month.